guests. Today we are very pleased as Rudaw Research Center to have you both on this virtual event about the fall of Afghanistan and future of U.S. policy in South Asia. So let me just start with a brief introduction just for the audience. So Ambassador Peter Galbraith, he has been ambassador in the Balkans in the past, and he was also deputy UN envoy in Afghanistan. And he has been engaged with the Kurds, since the early 90s, and also back in 2003 again, as advising the Kurds on the drafting Iraqi constitution. And General Ernie Odino also, he has been in the region in the past. Like he was the only U.S. general officer who has previously served a full year as a combat advisor embedded inside the Kurdish Peshmerga in Iraq. And currently he's a district director for the U.S. Congress of Michael Wallace, and also he's a senior military fellow at the Golden Institute for International Strategy and at the London Center for Policy Research. Thank you both for your time today to join us on this event. And let me start with just like a couple questions on the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. As we all know that the America, when they toppled Taliban back in 2001, and the reason was to make America safer and also the world safer. But now, what's the point like for the American withdrawal? I mean, let me rephrase the question, like what America has achieved in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. What are the main motivation and reasons for the America to withdraw at this stage from Afghanistan? Although there was like a deal back even at the Trump administration last year about to pull out all the U.S. forces. But I would like to take your views both as a former diplomat and former military general, which is important to have you both perspective on this. How do you see this recent developments in Afghanistan and how that will shape the U.S. policy and the Biden administration? So Ambassador, please.
Well, I made my first trip to Afghanistan on February 14th, 1989. Now that date is significant because it is the day that the Soviets finished their withdrawal. Mm-hmm. I was there incidentally with the Mujahideen. But the Soviet-installed Najibullah government lasted another 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal. In fact, it even lasted longer than the Soviet Union itself. By contrast, the American-sponsored Afghan government couldn't even last until the United States completed its withdrawal on the 31st of August. I cannot think of a bigger failure of strategy and of effort than this. We spent at some $2 trillion, nearly 2,500 American combat deaths, tens of thousands more wounded, 1,000 or more allied casualties, and the government and military, which we had been building, could not last 10 days. It's absolutely extraordinary. And I'm happy to discuss the reasons for the failure, but I would put at the top of the list the faulty strategy. Mm-hmm. Because the strategy in Afghanistan was to fight a counterinsurgency. And in order for a counterinsurgency to work, if General Petraeus was on this call, I think he would agree, you have to have a local partner. And the partner in Afghanistan, the government, was corrupt, ineffective, and after 3 consecutive fraudulent elections, illegitimate. And so instead of adopting a strategy that fit the facts, what the American military commanders did was to try to fit the facts to the strategy, to pretend they had a partner where they didn't, and to sell that to the civilian leadership. It is a failure that ought to produce a lot of soul searching. It doesn't mean that every intervention the United States engages in doesn't work, but there's some very specific ones that do work. And I'm glad that my friend and former student, General Ernie Ardino, is on this call because he was part of a success. Where the United States has intervened on behalf of a local party to help that party accomplish its objectives, it's worked. So it worked in Bosnia. In fact, we helped the Bosnian government defeat the Serbs, keep their country, and we didn't have a single American or Allied casualty. It worked in Kosovo, where we enabled the Kosovars to establish an independent country, again, without a single American or Allied casualty, and a total expenditure in each place in the neighborhood of $10 billion. It worked in Kurdistan, where we worked with the Peshmerga to accomplish their objectives, and in Syria with the Syrian Democratic Forces. In Syria, in the battle against the Islamic State, we had 5 combat American casualties. The Syrian Kurds took 10,000, and the Islamic State was defeated. It actually worked initially in Afghanistan, where we intervened with a relatively small force and on behalf of the Northern Alliance to enable the Northern Alliance, the group that the Taliban had never conquered, to obtain its objective, which was to take Kabul and oust the Taliban. And then, instead of continuing to work with the Northern government, Northern Alliance, allowing them to negotiate with the Pashtuns, the majority group in Afghanistan, we decided that we knew better and we would create a new Afghanistan with a highly centralized constitution in one of the most diverse countries ethnically and geographically, in which all power, instead of being in the different parts of Afghanistan where local groups could govern their own affairs, was concentrated in Kabul, and where in Kabul, all power was concentrated in the president, who could only be from one ethnic group, obviously, and all of the presidents of the last 20 years, the 2 of them were both Pashtuns. You know, a more intelligent design would have had very significant local government, like what exists in Iraq, and particularly in the Kurdistan region, with regions or provinces with enormous power to run their own affairs, with their own militaries being able to defend themselves, like the Peshmerga. What would have worked would have been a parliamentary system, like Iraq, where the different communities, the different ethnic groups and communities are representative, and then government is the process of coalition building. But when you had, as we did in Afghanistan, a winner-take-all system, it meant everything turned on those elections, and those elections were stolen. Mm-hmm. Karzai got his second term as a result of massive fraud. The UN covered up that fraud. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon deserves a lot of responsibility for this, since it was a UN-funded election, although the Obama administration also chose to overlook it. Then there was a second fraudulent election in 2014 that brought Ashraf Ghani to power. Again, the US administration and the UN overlooked the fraud, and a third one in 2019 in which Ashraf Ghani got a second term. Now, why is stealing elections such a problem? Because who steals elections? Corrupt people. And basically, if you steal an election, you can steal everything else. And that's basically what went on in Afghanistan. That's, in my judgment, the reason for this catastrophic failure, incidentally, where the objective that we went in to do, which was to oust the Taliban and drive out Al-Qaeda, was already accomplished by December 2001.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Ambassador. And now, so General, please, if you can also, I would like to hear your insights about this, same questions about, especially like militarily, as Ambassador mentioned that so basically, let's say the Afghan, forces were not really like a powerful, or like not like a partner, real partner of the US, so that they can, take care of the Afghanistan security. We'd like to hear more whether the main problems was from the American side, or whether really it's related to the corruption in the Afghanistan government, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be on. with my former and favorite professor, Ambassador Peter Galbraith. He was my professor for a few classes at the U.S. National War College, and really I credit him with a lot of inspiration for some of the work that I've been involved with ever since. Yeah, so let me start with this. Good strategy starts at the end, the place where vital national interests are served. And so I don't disagree with the ambassador's comments, but I want to add, a few nuances to that. Mm-hmm. Before there's strategy, there's an objective, there's an end state. And I'm not sure to this day that we Americans ever really understood what that end state was. Now, before I talk about what I think it was, it's important to say this, and I'll quote the most influential theorist on warfare in the Western Hemisphere, and that's Karl von Clausewitz. And Clausewitz said, "It's the value of the objective that determines the magnitude and the duration of any war any nation will wage in its pursuit." So if it's a low value objective, any nation can only wage a correspondingly low cost war. And if the costs rise and begin to exceed the perceived value of that objective, the war instantly goes into disequilibrium. And this is how you lose. But if it is a high value objective and it's understood, especially in a democracy, by the domestic audience, that this end state sought is of such supreme value to the United States, in this case, then we'll do anything. We'll put up with anything, and we'll stick with it for a long time. That is true for any nation. All right, so we went into Afghanistan for two reasons. Mm-hmm. To destroy the Taliban government and to defeat Al-Qaeda. And as the ambassador did within a matter of 2 months, that was accomplished. That was accomplished. But then we began to engage in some less understood, not well-defined objective that we kind of call nation building. I am not saying that nation building isn't, or well-built nations aren't desirable. But there's a tool for every job. And the military is just one element of our national power that a country can apply to solving a problem. In this case, building a nation that we hadn't really well defined. And I'll add this, the Army's contribution to winning wars is by breaking the enemy's will to fight. Mm-hmm. And the basic recipe for that, since dirt was invented, as I like to say, is by killing people and breaking stuff. That doesn't mean the war is over, but that is the military's contribution to winning that war. There are 3 other elements of national power that bear on this issue, and that is diplomatic, informational, and economic. So in this case, we built an Afghan army. We tried to put together a government. In most cases, the military, we tried to put it together in our own image, But I assert, and I've written about this in the past, I don't know that that is always the best option. And in this case, we tried to put together a national army that, frankly, now has proven that it has collapsed. It wasn't defeated by the Taliban. It collapsed of its own weight. And yet those members from the various ethnic demographics represented within that army, they've withdrawn, and many of them have withdrawn with their own weapons, and they've withdrawn to their ethnic identity groups. And so my forecast for the future, part of that forecast is we are likely to see more localized armed militias defending their own ethnic identities.
All right, thank you, General. So actually, just staying with you, just especially starting from the last point. So right now, I mean, and we'll come back to the deal, whether that's going to work or not. But let me start with a question about like the having more like this kind of a non-state armed actors around Afghanistan, and as like new threat again emerging in Afghanistan. But what's the like a main concern about, like for example, there's some information about some of the even Air Force of Afghanistan Army now is being like also taken by the Taliban, which is like not many Islamic organization in the world they have like any Air Force or aircrafts. How much America would worry about this now? I mean, if like now they can make more like security threats around in South Asia, or maybe that would move to the hands to other people, as like it happened before, like collaboration between Taliban and some other extremist organization around the world.
Yeah, so if I understand the question, you're essentially asking, what is a threat from a possible Taliban Air Force, for example?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not going to discount it, because back during 2001, when U.S. forces, those first 12 American special forces, when they linked up with the Northern Alliance, with Dostum and Ahmed Shah, well, not Ahmed Shah Massoud, but the Northern Alliance, the Taliban at times had aircraft. They also had Soviet tanks. Now, those are all defeated on the battlefield. And I also want to add that those are sophisticated pieces of equipment. They've got to be maintained. They've got to be prepared. They've got to be logistically supplied. So, you know, every weapon has its own costs, and those costs at some point can multiply. And having watched the challenge of logistics in some of the world's war zones, I would say tactics are very simple, but logistics are very difficult. I think the logistics aspect of that will be a great challenge over time to a Taliban government, and I put that term in quotation marks. But I'll also add this. I have seen reports right now, it was within hours of Kabul's fall, of so-called technicians from both Tehran and Pakistan already inside Afghanistan, dismantling U.S. equipment, including aircraft. Now, we can presume that those components are being smuggled out of the country to both Tehran and Pakistan. And for what purpose?
Okay, so that means that there's not much worry about actually the U.S. weapons goes to the hand of the Taliban. It's just like, you know, as before, because of the Iraqi forces withdrawal from Mosul, you know, what happened in other places when the ISIS actually took over all these weapons. And I mean, not, of course, not Air Force, but like the U.S. made weapons. So that was made them stronger in that sense. So now it means like, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was speaking only of the aircraft. The other weapons that are on the battlefield, those will be a significant threat to anyone operating to counter the Taliban. And it will be a significant threat. It's a greatly increased threat on the battlefield now. They've not only accomplished the capture of lethal weapons, but also those that contribute to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. That's the type of combat multiplier that makes a lethal army much, much more lethal. And in this case, this is what we're going to have to fight our way back into it if that decision is made.
All right, thanks. So, Ambassador, regarding to the latest developments right now in Afghanistan, so now the deadline is 31st August for the full withdrawal from the Kabul airport. So if they let's say if they didn't meet the deadline, I mean the U.S. didn't meet the deadline, what Taliban is asking, so what's going to happen? Do you think it's likely there will be clashes with Taliban, and whether also the future scenario? Do you think if, for example, if Taliban became like another threat, or there were like some other emerging like a terrorist organization starting from Afghanistan again. Do you think it's likely U.S. will return back to Afghanistan again in the future?
To take the second question first, if Al-Qaeda established itself in Afghanistan, if the Islamic State, which is already there, but which the Taliban is very much opposed to and has been fighting, but if somehow the Taliban decides to take a live and let live approach to the Islamic State, then I think it's likely that there will be a resumed U.S. Presence at some point, or at least military actions. The Taliban do have an incentive not to allow Al-Qaeda to come back, because that's what caused the ouster of their regime 20 years ago. There are many problems. At first, it's not clear that they will. I mean, one can approach their promises with skepticism. I would give greater credence to this particular promise because it's so much in their interest, but I don't give full credence. I'm much more skeptical of their promises to protect women and girls, or to respect the Hazaras, who are an ethnic minority who not only look different because they're of Mongolian origin, but who are Shiite and therefore viewed by the Salafi Taliban as jihadis. And in the 90s, there was a beginning of a genocide there. So I do think that there is if the Taliban does allow Al-Qaeda back in, or doesn't really take action against the Islamic State, yes, I think that could bring the U.S. back in. There's been a lot of criticism of President Biden for not extending the August 31 deadline. And I think that deadline should be extended because it's clear that not everybody who we should be bringing out will be out by the 31st of August. That said, the time to extend the deadline is probably the 31st of August, because if you announce that you want to extend it before, you are going to invite attacks on those who are trying to leave. In fact, the logical thing for the Taliban to do would be to prevent people from leaving, possibly take shots at American aircraft at the airport itself, because they would not want the deadline extended. But if they're presented with a fait accompli on the 31st of August, and it's clear that it's a few more days or another week, the situation would be different. The calculus for them would be different. I want to say I don't know whether that will happen or not. I do believe the deadline should be extended.
Yeah. So regarding to the humanitarian situation, as we all know that now the America's main efforts is actually to help out these Afghan people who they have worked with the American forces to help them out to the U.S. or other safer places. But how much either what do you think what the U.S. or other allies or partners should do regarding to the humanitarian situation? Because a lot of people criticizing now the American government right now when it comes to this point, and how much will damage the U.S. sort of image in the world if America cannot step in enough when it comes to humanitarian help for the Afghan people. I mean, not only those who they have worked in, of course, these are more vulnerable because of the work they have done with the American or the coalition forces in Afghanistan in the past, but also in general, the population will be also vulnerable, will be at risk for bringing back the similar restriction they had, although sometimes the Taliban now they try to show that they're more a moderate, but there is no we haven't seen their new government yet, so we'll see maybe soon they might will be similar extremist will be government for the Afghan people. So I mean, what do you think how much the U.S. and the international community can do in terms of the human rights and their human condition of Afghan people.
Well,
Yeah.
first, the obvious point is to take out those Afghans who are at risk and those Afghans who participated in the international effort. And that is not just, there's been a lot of emphasis on interpreters and people who worked with the military or with the embassy. But it's not, that's not there are others who are equally deserving. Obviously, those who worked with our coalition partners, and there is an effort to take care of them. But a good part of the UN mission, for example, was part of the same international effort that began in 2001. Some parts, like UNICEF, had been there all along, but others, like those that supported the Afghan elections, or Human Rights Unit, or Women's Unit, or the Human Rights Investigators, those are people who are at risk. And then there are the NGOs, whether they were government funded or ones that were encouraged to stand up, the human rights organizations, women's organizations, and journalists. There's a whole generation of Afghan journalists, many of them educated by the West, who operate in a Western style, and others who have adopted this, and so they too are at risk. So it's a large number of people who are at risk, in addition to the as I say, the Hazaras. So I think we should be, we have an obligation to all of those people. As to the question of, how has this damaged America's standing in the world? There's no doubt that there is some damage. I think that the damage from this is likely to be very short-lived. I remember when Saigon fell, after, we lost 55,000 Americans fighting that war, which until Afghanistan had been America's longest war. And in fact, one of the arguments for continuing to send young Americans to Vietnam was that if we lose, it will really damage America's standing in the world. That was an argument actually for continuing the war. And when Saigon fell, there were all these dire comments about America losing its leadership, but that didn't happen. It remained the dominant power. And what was it, 15 years later, its adversary, the Soviet Union, was already gone. So I think any suggestion that this is going to do lasting damage is too much. But I do think America's standing in the world has declined over the last 20 years. Partly, what happened in the 1990s, that was a unipolar moment with the collapse of the Soviet Union that in any event was never going to last. Russia was going to bounce back, as it has. China was continuing to grow. India has emerged as an important power. So we were never going to be what we were in the 90s. But then there were a series of events that, in my view, have damaged America's prestige. The first among those was the invasion of Iraq, but which the rest of the world saw as unjustified. And then the way it was conducted was a huge debacle. The other thing I would say, the erratic behavior of the last 4 years, at least that's how the world has seen that. And finally, it's a little hard to promote democracy when a majority of elected representatives of one political party actually vote against accepting the results of a fully legitimate election. So there are a lot of things that have damaged America's standing in the world. And I think this is not going to be that high on the list.
All right, thanks. General, please, if you have some
Yeah,
comments on that as well.
I'll take the question regarding the humanitarian situation first. So I'm going to begin, though, by orienting on what I think are vital U.S. interests at stake. If we're going to do anything, we have to be first clear up front what are our interests. And I think right now, the priority is to save American citizens and those partners on the ground who are at risk. That's got to be number one. Number two, we have a continuing vital interest in countering the development of terror states. That is in the interest of not just the United States, but all of humanity. And three, we have a continuing interest in disrupting our adversaries' malign initiatives across the globe. And I'm not necessarily going to get deep into those right now, but I think it's important that we get those established up front. So saving American citizens and partners includes elements, for example, of the National Resistance Front, the Northern Alliance, for a lot of reasons that we don't necessarily need to get into right now, but one is very clear. We have some untold number, and that number, the administration says vigorously, is a classified number. I can understand that, but it's much more in terms of American citizens that are at risk and partners who are at risk than we saw in Tehran in 1979. The hostage crisis in Iran in 1979, if we thought that was a crisis, what we're about to see in Afghanistan is going to make that 1975 crisis look like a picnic. The numbers they far exceed what was involved in Tehran at the time. So that's problem number one, or that's reality number one. The other element here is it's going to be very difficult to get these people out. Let's just be honest. It's going to be very difficult. And just because it's difficult doesn't mean we don't do it, but it's a very difficult matter. And it's going to have to involve much more than just Americans going in and trying to get these people out, or Westerners going in to try to get these people out. It's also going to include their exfiltration via any means to safe havens. So it is in our interest to help establish safe havens over key portions of Afghanistan, and I would say the provinces to the north of Kabul, over key portions of the north. And I would use the 1991 example of Operation Provide Comfort, which Peter was an architect of, as a very good example. It fits in many very important ways with what is about to develop inside Afghanistan. So it is in our interest to motivate the assembly of a 21st century version of Operation Provide Comfort, a safe haven umbrella over provinces to the north of Kabul. And that's a whole discussion in and of itself, but it is something extremely important. Now, so that's on the humanitarian matter. On the damage to the United States, well, I may not be as confident that it's not as damaging as Peter is on this. I'll disagree a little bit. We have the European Parliament voting to hold our president in contempt. We have undermined our credibility with world leaders, allies. Right now, if you were sitting in Taiwan, how much faith would you have that the United States would be there when you need them? So, as I mentioned previously, with four elements of national power, one being diplomatic, our diplomatic influence right now is far less than what it was before Kabul fell. And it's going to be with us for a long time. Now, I'll add this. I'll close with this.
All right, thanks. Actually, just staying with you, General, first, and then I'll come back to Ambassador regarding to how much actually this withdrawal will affect the U.S. internal policy. I mean, or will make internal pressure on the Biden administration to change its foreign policy for the next 3 years. I mean, on Afghanistan, also on South Asia, and maybe on other places. Maybe when there are like America, if they plan to withdraw, like even from Iraq or other places, maybe then there will be discussion about how much like there will be impact of any sudden U.S. withdrawal from those regions around the world, especially since you are like working with with a congressman, and also you talk to a lot of congressmen in the U.S. So how much that will like bring more like sort of political division inside America, and or sort of like will have impact on the Biden administration in the next 3 years?
I think it's going to occupy all the air in the room at the White House, especially as hostages start getting taken, and they will. The Taliban has right now a lever, a very, very powerful lever over the world superpower, and it is not in the Taliban's interest to relinquish that lever. That is the lever they have via those many potential hostages inside Afghanistan. We have committed a grave error, and that was ceding the initiative to the enemy, and he has no interest in ceding it back. None. And so this president, I wish him the best. No, I absolutely wish him the best, but he is going to be bogged in this every minute of every day. It's just a fact of the matter. And I just don't see that changing. I'm not sure how this White House is going to be able to achieve overwhelming effect on many other topics of great interest in the United States. This is going to be the big elephant in the room.
All right, thanks. So Ambassador, please, so also I would like to take your view on that. So how much this will really like impact the Biden administration, especially like since even the deal with Taliban that was made and the Trump administration, like it was, I think goes back to February last year when they met in Qatar with Pompeo. And now it seems like even the like Republican, they're criticizing Biden administration for this kind of withdrawal. But it looks like so both Democrats and Republican, they were involved in this deal. So how do you see that will like sort of shape the U.S. policy in the future?
Yeah, I mean, one of the features of American politics in recent years is that it's much more important to fight your political enemy domestically and score points than it is to serve the national interest. And we've seen that on a variety of things. I mean, I recall in the Syria intervention, there was a huge clamor from the Republican Party to intervene in Syria. And then President Obama submitted a resolution and they opposed it. So, you know, what can I say? Here, you know, the facts are that this agreement was negotiated by the Trump administration. It was done so without including the Afghan government. It would have had all U.S. troops out by the 31st of May. And it involved, and this is critically important, a truce between the United States and the Taliban, in which the Taliban did not attack U.S. soldiers. And that's what enabled the United States to reduce the troops to the number of 2,500. Now, if President Biden had broken the Trump agreement, what would have happened is that the Taliban would have started to specifically target American and coalition troops. And so he would have had to greatly increase the number of troops and would have had to re-escalate the war. And you know, he obviously was unwilling to do that. But the idea that you could have kept 2,500 troops there and somehow the Afghan government, you know, everything would have gone on, and you know, that really there's no basis for thinking that. I'd also like to just say a word about the withdrawal process, which yes, it's been chaotic. I'm not quite sure how else you could do it, because who are the people at risk? Most at risk are, you know, the high-ranking Afghan officials, high-ranking military officials. So what do? Once you've announced your withdrawal, you start pulling those people out, then you're accused of precipitating the collapse that followed. Sure, there have been errors in what has happened, and there's been chaos, and the images are gut-wrenching. And I'm talking to friends in Kabul, Afghan friends, and they're, you know, I could tell you many heartbreaking stories. But you know, it is hard to see how that could have been done in a different manner. I want to turn to a point that Ernie made, which is very important. When I was appointed the Deputy UN Envoy to Afghanistan, I traveled all over the country, but my first trip was to go up to the Panjshir Valley, because this was a legendary place. This is where Ahmad Shah Massoud and the Panjshiris had resisted the Soviet Union. They'd never conquered the Panjshir Valley. The Taliban had never conquered the Panjshir Valley. And today, the Panjshir Valley is in the hands of the National Resistance Front. And it is relatively close to the Hazarajat, the Central Highlands, where the Hazaras live, which is a group that, again, experienced what I believe were the beginnings of genocide in the later phases of the Taliban rule. And so there are people who deserve protection. Now, at the moment, the Panjshiris do not require military support, air power. They've always been well armed, but a lot of people are fleeing to the Panjshir because they can't get to the airport. They aren't on the list. And the Panjshir, which has an indigenous population of 100,000, can only accommodate so many people. So certainly there's a basis, even very soon, I suppose, really once the evacuation is complete, for then trying to get humanitarian assistance up to the Panjshir. And the other point I'd make, and again, Ernie touched on this, there's been resistance early on to the Taliban. Strikingly, demonstrations in Jalalabad, which really is a city in the Pashtun heartland, and in Kabul, the national resistance captured a couple of the Taliban governors, or one governor, one deputy governor. So I would not be surprised if we began to see a movement emerge in Afghanistan rather on the model of the Taliban, and particularly in the Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara parts of the country. Resistance beginning in the villages, beginning in the countryside, against what is basically seen as a Pashtun a rule, and pretty much against the values of some of these other ethnic communities. Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the urban areas of Afghanistan, because Kabul was a city, I think, of less than 1 million in 2001. Maybe it's 7 million now. The coalition didn't do much for Afghans who lived in the countryside, and that's one reason the Taliban has prevailed. In fact, the Afghan government, probably spent its time, particularly with its corruption, with its abuse, losing support in the countryside. But urban Afghans have done well, and they've connected to the global economy. And so it's hard to see how they're going to accept a new Taliban regime. Now, I think in Afghanistan, it's relatively easy to organize armed resistance in the villages and the mountains. I don't know quite how you do it in the urban areas. But to say that the Taliban are in control and we're just going to see a stable but repressive Afghanistan under the Taliban, well, I think that's a very open question. I watch this space.
All right, thanks. Let's go to some of the other issues related to that, like the geopolitical impact of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, return Taliban to Afghanistan, and how that do you think will impact the U.S. relations with China, Russia? I mean, especially also their position on Taliban, and also with Turkey. So that's part one. Also, do you see that having Taliban return to Afghanistan as a Sunni force taking over again next to Iran? Do you think that will lead to sort of a balance of power in the Middle East?
No. I mean, first, I think Afghanistan's very far away from the United States. It has a border, albeit almost impenetrable border with China, but it's right in China's neighborhood, and it's close to Russia. It borders the countries of the former Soviet Union and right next to nuclear-armed Pakistan, not far from India. So what has happened is a much bigger issue for those countries than it is for the United States. And I think particularly the Taliban, Afghanistan, and Iran are headed for bad relations, if not outright conflict. In the 1990s, the Taliban took over Mazar-e-Sharif. It massacred, took over the Iranian consulate, massacred the diplomats, began the massacre of the Hazaras, and in some sense, the United States and Iran have had very similar policy interests actually throughout this century. It might have been better if they, coordinated more, but both countries were very much against the Taliban. Both countries are very much against Sunni Salafi jihadis who consider Shiites to be apostates. And both countries, with the United States and Iraq did what Iran had wanted for decades. It got rid of Saddam Hussein in 3 weeks, and through democratic elections allowed Shiite religious parties that Iran had sponsored. One of them had been founded in Tehran to take power. I mean, Iran couldn't have had a more happy result from the American effort in Iraq. So, there is a certain alignment of American and Iranian interests, even if the leaders of neither country wish to admit this.
All right, thank you. Actually, my final question will be like two parts. That's for both of you, I think, because since you both been in Iraq Kurdistan region as well in the past, and you have quite a lot of experience and also connections around here. So because now after what happened in Afghanistan, so there are a lot of like talks and concerns, especially like among the Kurds and the Sunnis, whether after the U.S. withdrawal. I mean, of course, according to the strategic deal between Iraq and America is only to withdraw the combat forces from Iraq, but still some kind of a concern whether what will happen later, especially since we have seen the Iraqi forces capability, like back in 2014, when basically they just withdrew and and ISIS took over in many parts in the Sunni areas. So my question, first of all, whether America will repeat such a scenario in Iraq or also in Rojava in northeast Syria, and secondly, do you see the Kurdish forces, Peshmerga, and the Iraqi forces as sort of a trained forces by the Americans and the other coalitions, where they will be enough ready to counter any enemy that emerging in the future against them across this region. So I mean, especially now, still there's a threat of ISIS, and also the fear also of all these different militia groups across Iraq. So some people, they think without the American presence in Iraq, it's possible ISIS will return to some of the areas, or militias will taking over in many parts, maybe mostly either like in the south or some of the parts in the north part. So just general, if you want to
policy. Let me address the policy questions, and then I think General Odino is very well qualified to speak about the Peshmerga and their capabilities. I don't want to preclude him from weighing in on the policy, although I suspect we'll be in violent agreement on most of the points here. But as you'll recall, I said where the United States has successfully intervened, it has been with a local partner in support of their objectives. Mm-hmm. And, if you look at Iraq, the Iraq operation, where the United States tried to make a unified democratic Iraq, the only place where the U.S. was not militarily present as a occupying force was Kurdistan. And if we look 20 years, was it now 18 years, so far, not a single American has lost his or her life in the Kurdistan region. What's defined as the Kurdistan region in the Constitution. In Syria, again, the SDF, the Syrian Kurds, basically lost 10,000 dead. The United States lost 5. We were acting in support of that partner. Joe Biden it has a very personal connection to the Kurds. I know this because in 1990, after Saddam invaded Kuwait, Jalal Talabani and Hoshyar Zabari and Sami Abdul Rahman, Najmuddin Karim, well, Najmuddin was living in Washington, but they came, the others came to Washington, and I introduced them to the Foreign Relations Committee, including to Joe Biden. And he visited Kurdistan during the Saddam's time, spoke to the Kurdistan parliament. On a personal level, he and his team have a very strong commitment to Kurdistan. So I think, in terms of being committed to Kurdistan, to the Peshmerga, I think that's there. Now, with regard to Syria, of course, it was Trump who, just days after we had prevailed against ISIS, spoke to Erdogan and then gave Erdogan a green light to invade northeast Turkey, and that obviously shook the confidence of the Syrian Kurds. And he also announced the withdrawal. Now, he was persuaded to protect the oil fields of Deir ez-Zor, not the people. But the way the military structured this, it turns out the troops were up in Qamishli, hundreds of miles from the oil fields they were ostensibly protecting. So we got through that period. The Biden administration has gone to Rojava. They have met with the top leaders there, and they have made a commitment of continuing support. So I think, the Syrian Kurds can for sure count on a continuing American presence at a low level for the next 4 years. Now, obviously, we can shift radically in our foreign policy from one election to the next. That didn't used to be the case. There used to be great consistency, but now you enter into an agreement, then you withdraw from it, and so on. So, but at least for 4 years there, and I'm feeling that the position of Iraqi Kurdistan is even more secure. I also don't see, there isn't a Taliban equivalent in Iraq, even even in the Islamic State. Its appeal never obviously went beyond the Sunni areas, because after all, Iraq, 60% Shia, is not going to want a Sunni Salafi government that views them as apostates. So, I do think there's a risk of the return of ISIS, largely because the Sunnis are not reconciled to Iraq, and secondly, they see the PMF and particularly the PMF, which is after all government sponsored, as a hostile occupying force, and the largely Shiite army doesn't view itself as defending Iraq. This is what happened in 2014. I mean, it's incredible what happened. Fewer than 1,000 fighters in pickup trucks with machine guns took over Mosul in 36 hours, where ostensibly there were 30,000 troops with state-of-the-art American military equipment. So I think that danger is there. I think the solution, and I think General Adina would be very well equipped to speak to the capabilities of the Peshmerga, including to handle, equipment. But I would like to see our modern equipment go to the Peshmerga much more than I'd like to see it go to the Iraqi army, because I think those are the people that we can count on.
So,
Please, General.
yes. So if I could pick up on that, yeah, thank you, Peter. First, to your first question, I know we've only got about 5 minutes left. Will the United States withdraw its combat power from Iraq in total? Well, that's really a question for the White House. Who knows what they're going to do, but the rationale for keeping them there is solid. That doesn't change. And the fact of the matter is that well, let's look back to World War II. When we defeated Nazi Germany, after the war, the United States kept hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops forward deployed. It's not that we wanted to exploit those countries, but we needed We needed to be positioned to deter future adversaries. We kept hundreds of thousands in Central Europe after the war, and no one in the United States was really clamoring to bring them home. We kept many tens of thousands in Asia. No one was clamoring to bring them home. North Korea, after the Korean War, we kept divisions on the peninsula, and they're still there to this day. Again, because we recognized that there were other threats that needed to be deterred. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, so does foreign policy. And we saw what happened in 2011, in December 2011, when President Obama withdrew the United States combat power from Iraq. Tehran surged in, and they're still there. So they've essentially fundamentally annexed the southern 60% of Iraq and nearly 100% of the Iraqi army, and we have what we have. All right, as to the Peshmerga, you know, it's, as I like to say, and I wrote about this previously, it's relatively simple and easy to train an indigenous unit to do, for any purpose, defend a central government, right? But changing what they think is important, that's a different matter. And that requires people who understand the narrative, how an indigenous group sees itself, what it thinks is important. And that means what it's willing to fight for. And we can look at the Peshmerga and the Kurds. They're Sunni too, but the black flag of ISIS has never flown on a single inch of Kurdish-controlled soil. Kurdistan has been essentially immune and resistant to jihadi influences over time, back as at least as far back as the early 60s. Outside, Sunni extremists have been trying to proselytize within Iraqi Kurdistan, and they've never made much ground. Ansar al-Islam aside, and there were some predecessor groups to Ansar al-Islam. I think one was Bazutna. They never really gained traction. So the Peshmerga have something that many others do not. They have this overriding understanding that they have seen the worst that humanity can dish out, and they have no interest in seeing that again. None. They didn't stand up to it. They stood up to ISIS when the Iraqi army crumbled. And when the Iraqi army ran away from Mosul, the Peshmerga ran forward and established a 1,000-kilometer border forward line of troops against this ISIS predation, and then very methodically cleared areas after that. And I have no concerns that the Peshmerga are well prepared to do anything like that again. Proud to have served with them.
Yeah, thank you. I think we ran out of time. I think thank you for both of you today being with us on this event, and looking forward to have you in the future events with the Rudaw Research Center. Thank you very much for your time today. Have a good day.
Same to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. سپاس. آخره چونه به بوچی.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
We're a good program.
آخر براسي سابني اسمه كوبوني لسروب كم يساقون والله عربي صداي بزنر والله هر حساب لودی کن کنورتیش که خیره کانورتی که جربش مشته